Karen had always wanted to visit London. She had seen pictures of Buckingham Palace, the grand home of the British royal family, and heard about the famous royal guards who stood outside, dressed in their red coats and tall black hats. She had watched videos of these guards standing still, not moving even when people made funny faces at them or tried to make them laugh. To her, they looked like actors in a show, something like the street performers she had seen back home. When she finally arrived at the palace during her trip, she was excited to see the guards in person. The sun was shining, and hundreds of tourists stood near the black gates, taking pictures and watching the soldiers march back and forth. Karen was fascinated. She stood there for a while, snapping pictures, but after a few minutes, she wanted to do more than just watch. She wanted to test the guards, to see if they were really as serious as people said. She noticed a guard standing perfectly still, gripping his rifle tightly. His face was like a statue, expressionless, completely focused. A mischievous idea popped into her head. What if she got a reaction out of him? Would he flinch? Would he say something? Would he laugh? The idea made her grin. She wasn't trying to be mean. She just thought it would be a fun little joke, something she could tell her friends about later. So, without thinking much about it, she stepped closer. The tourists around her were busy with their own cameras and conversations, so no one stopped her. Her heart pounded with excitement as she reached out her hand toward the rifle, just to touch it for a second. The moment her fingers brushed the barrel of the weapon, everything changed. The guard, who had been as still as a statue just seconds ago, suddenly came to life. Before she could even react, his boot slammed against the ground with a loud, sharp stomp, sending a shock through her body. His voice, deep and powerful, rang through the air as he shouted, "Stand back." Karen jumped, her breath catching in her throat. The people around her gasped, turning their heads toward the commotion. Some quickly pulled out their phones, realizing something unusual was happening. The guard's eyes locked onto her, intense and unmoving. In that split second, Karen's heart raced with panic. This wasn't funny anymore. The rifle, which she had thought was just for show, was now firmly in the guard's grasp, ready for action. She took a step back, suddenly realizing she had made a mistake. The air around her felt heavy, as if she had crossed an invisible line she never should have touched. Her face turned red as whispers spread through the crowd. What had she just done? Had she really just grabbed a soldier's weapon? The excitement she had felt only moments ago disappeared, replaced by fear and embarrassment. And in that moment, she knew this was not going to end well. Karen stood frozen in place, her heart pounding like a drum. She hadn't expected such a loud and sudden reaction. The guard's voice was still echoing in her ears, and for the first time, she felt a wave of fear rush through her. This wasn't the playful moment she had imagined. This wasn't a joke anymore. People around her whispered in hushed voices. Some tourists had already started recording, their phones aimed directly at her. A few looked shocked, while others shook their heads. Karen could feel their eyes on her, judging her, but she was too stunned to move. She had only meant to touch the rifle for a second, just to see what would happen. In her mind, it had been a harmless, funny moment, something she could laugh about later. But now, standing face to face with a royal guard who looked as serious as a soldier in battle, she realized how wrong she had been. The guard had not only yelled, but had also stepped into a firm, defensive position. His hands gripped the rifle tightly, his posture strong and ready. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes were sharp and focused. It was clear he was not just a performer. He was a trained soldier, and he was treating this as a real threat. Karen swallowed hard, suddenly feeling small in front of him. She wanted to explain, to tell him she hadn't meant any harm, but the words got stuck in her throat. What could she even say? "I was just joking" didn't seem like the right thing to say anymore. She took a small step back, hoping that would calm the situation, but the guard didn't relax. His body remained stiff, his hand still gripping the weapon as if he were prepared for anything. The moment stretched on. heavy with tension. Then, out of nowhere, a stern voice broke through the silence. "Step away from the guard immediately." Karen turned her head and saw two police officers walking toward her. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions serious. The crowd parted to make way for them, and suddenly, Karen felt her stomach twist with nervousness. One of the officers, a tall man with sharp eyes, stopped right in front of her. He didn't look angry, but he wasn't smiling either. "Do you understand what you just did?" he asked in a calm yet firm voice. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She felt a lump in her throat as she realized how much trouble she might be in. The other officer glanced at the guard, who had now returned to his position, but remained on high alert. "These soldiers are not here for entertainment," the officer continued, looking back at her. "They are highly trained, and their job is to protect this place. Touching a soldier's weapon is not a joke. It's a serious offense." Karen felt her face burn with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear, but it was too late. She had made a mistake, and now everyone was watching to see what would happen next. The air around Karen felt heavy as the police officers stood in front of her. The reality of the situation was sinking in fast. She had only wanted to have a little fun, but now it felt like the entire world was watching her. The Royal Guard, who had shouted at her just moments ago, was still standing firm, his grip on the rifle unshaken. His eyes remained locked forward, as if nothing had happened. But Karen knew that wasn't true. She had broken some kind of rule, one she hadn't even thought about before reaching for that rifle. The taller officer took a small step closer. "Miss, do you understand how serious this is?" His voice wasn't angry, but it was firm, like a teacher scolding a student. Karen swallowed hard and nodded. I didn't mean anything bad," she finally managed to say, her voice shaky. "I thought it was just a joke." The officer sighed, shaking his head slightly. "These guards are not actors. They are real soldiers. They are trained to protect this palace, and they follow strict rules. When you grabbed his weapon, you crossed a line. Do you understand why that's dangerous?" Karen's face turned red with embarrassment. She had never felt so foolish in her life. She nodded again, this time more sincerely. I do now," she whispered. Behind her, the crowd was still watching. Some people had their phones raised, recording everything. She could already imagine the headlines. "Tourist tries to grab Royal Guard's rifle. Instantly regrets it." The thought made her stomach twist. She just wanted this moment to be over. The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes, spoke next. "If you had done this with a police officer or a soldier anywhere else, you could have been arrested on the spot. Do you realize that?" Karen's heart skipped a beat. Arrested? She hadn't even thought about that. Her hands grew clammy as she quickly shook her head. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really didn't mean any harm." The female officer studied her for a moment, then exchanged a quick glance with her partner. Finally, she let out a small sigh. "You need to leave the palace grounds immediately," she said. "Consider this a warning. But if you try anything like this again, there will be consequences." Karen nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. I understand. I'm leaving right now." She turned on her heel, eager to escape the stares of the crowd. As she hurried away, she could still hear murmurs from the people around her. Some sounded amused, others shocked. A few laughed, shaking their heads at her mistake. She wanted to disappear, to undo the last few minutes of her life. But there was no going back. She had learned a lesson she would never forget. The Royal Guards were not there for entertainment. They were not statues. They were real soldiers, ready to act in an instant. And she had been just one step away from finding out exactly how serious they could be. Karen walked away as fast as she could, her face still burning with embarrassment. She could feel the eyes of the crowd following her, their whispers filling the air. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. She had come to Buckingham Palace expecting to have a fun day, to take pictures, and make memories. Instead, she had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Her heart was still racing. The sound of the guard's voice, yelling, "Stand back," kept repeating in her head. She had never heard someone speak with so much power before. It wasn't just loud. It was commanding, firm, and full of authority. It was the kind of voice that made people listen without question. She finally reached a bench near the palace gates and sat down, taking a deep breath. The cool air did little to calm her nerves. A group of tourists nearby was still talking about what had happened. "Did you see that?" one man said, shaking his head. "She actually grabbed his rifle." "Who does that?" A woman beside him chuckled. "I thought he was going to tackle her. That was crazy." Karen shrank in her seat. She wanted to pretend she didn't hear them, but their words stung. She had made a mistake, one that people would probably talk about for the rest of the day, maybe even longer. She pulled out her phone, hoping to distract herself, but as soon as she opened social media, her stomach dropped. Videos of the incident were already spreading. Someone had uploaded a clip of her grabbing the rifle, and in just minutes, it had been shared dozens of times. The comments were pouring in. What was she thinking? That guard handled it like a pro. This is why you don't mess with the royal guards. Karen felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't expected this to turn into such a big deal. She had thought it would be a harmless joke, but now, the whole world seemed to be laughing at her. As she scrolled through the videos, she came across another post explaining the history of the royal guards. She clicked on it, curious. The post talked about how these soldiers were not just there for show. They were real, highly trained military personnel. They had served in wars, completed intense training, and were responsible for protecting the palace from any threats. Karen stared at the screen, realization sinking in. She had treated them like performers in a tourist attraction, but they were anything but that. They took their duty seriously, and she had disrespected that. A deep sense of regret filled her. She had never meant to be disrespectful, but now she understood why the situation had escalated so quickly. The guard had reacted because his job was to protect. If she had pushed any further, things could have ended much worse. As she sat there, watching the video of herself go viral, she knew one thing for sure. This was a mistake she would never make again. Karen sat on the bench, her hands gripping her phone tightly. Her heart was still beating fast, and her face felt hot. She had made a mistake, one that the whole world was now watching. The video of her grabbing the royal guard's rifle was spreading quickly online, and the comments were brutal. Why would she do that? People need to respect soldiers. She's lucky she didn't get arrested. She swallowed hard, feeling sick to her stomach. She had never imagined that a few seconds of poor judgment could turn into something this big. She had only wanted to have fun, to see if the guard would react. But now she was being talked about by strangers all over the internet. Looking around, she noticed that some people were still whispering and glancing in her direction. A few were even watching the video on their phones. The embarrassment felt unbearable. She wanted to go back in time, to stop herself before she made the mistake. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching. When she looked up, she saw one of the police officers who had spoken to her earlier. He had a serious but calm expression on his face. Karen's stomach tightened. Was she in even more trouble? The officer stopped in front of her and spoke in a low voice. "Are you all right?" Karen was surprised by the question. She had expected more scolding, but instead, the officer seemed to be checking on her. She hesitated before nodding. I didn't mean to cause trouble," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer sighed. "I believe that," he said, "but you need to understand that actions have consequences. What you did could have been dangerous. For you and for everyone around." Karen looked down at her hands. "I know," she said softly. "I wasn't thinking." The officer nodded. "The royal guards aren't just standing there for show. They're trained to react to any possible threat. If you had pushed further, the situation could have ended very differently." Karen shivered at the thought. She had seen how fast the guard had reacted. What if she had done something even worse without thinking? What if they had mistaken her for someone trying to cause harm? The thought made her feel even more foolish. The officer studied her for a moment. "Consider this a lesson," he said. "Respect the rules, respect the people doing their jobs, and think before you act." Karen nodded again, truly understanding now. "I'm really sorry," she said. "I won't ever do something like this again." The officer gave her a small nod before walking away, leaving Karen alone with her thoughts. She took a deep breath and looked down at her phone one more time. The video was still spreading, but now she didn't care as much about what people were saying. What mattered most was that she had learned something important, something she would never forget. Karen sat quietly on the bench, thinking about everything that had happened. The crowd near Buckingham Palace had started to move on, focusing on other things, but she still felt the weight of her mistake. The police officer's words echoed in her mind. Respect the rules. Think before you act. She had always thought of herself as a fun and adventurous person, someone who liked to joke around. But today, she had crossed a line without realizing it. She had treated the royal guards like tourist attractions instead of what they really were, trained soldiers. Her phone buzzed again. She hesitated before looking at the screen. More notifications, more comments. Some were harsh, calling her disrespectful or foolish. Others joked about the situation, making memes out of the video. But one comment caught her attention. People need to understand that the royal guards have real responsibilities. This isn't a game. Karen exhaled slowly. That was exactly what she hadn't understood before. The guards weren't there to entertain tourists. They were protecting something important. She had seen them as part of the experience instead of real professionals doing their job. She suddenly felt an urge to do something, to make things right, at least in a small way. She couldn't erase what had happened, but maybe she could show that she had learned her lesson. She opened her social media app and took a deep breath before typing. "I want to apologize for my actions today at Buckingham Palace. I didn't fully understand the importance of the royal guards and the role they play in protecting the palace. I now realize my mistake, and I regret disrespecting them. This was a lesson I won't forget. Please remember to respect those who serve and protect." She hesitated for a moment before pressing post. Almost immediately, people started reacting. Some were still critical, but others appreciated her apology. One person replied, "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Hopefully, other tourists will learn from this too." Karen sighed, feeling a little lighter. She knew not everyone would forgive her, but at least she had owned up to her mistake. That was something. She stood up from the bench, ready to leave the palace area. As she walked away, she glanced back one last time. The royal guards were still standing tall, still focused, still as disciplined as ever. They hadn't changed, but she had. This trip to London had turned out differently than she had expected. She had come looking for fun, but she had left with a lesson she would remember for a lifetime. As Karen walked away from Buckingham Palace, she felt like a different person. The excitement she had felt at the beginning of the day was gone, replaced by deep reflection. She had made a mistake, one that had been caught on camera and shared with the world. But more importantly, she had learned something valuable. She wandered through the streets of London, trying to clear her mind. The city was still full of life. Tourists taking pictures, buses moving through the streets, people laughing and chatting. But Karen felt like she was in her own little world, replaying the day's events in her head. She pulled out her phone again, unsure if she wanted to look. To her surprise, her apology post was getting a lot of positive responses. Many people appreciated that she had taken responsibility for her actions. One comment stood out. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." Karen smiled a little. That was true. She had acted carelessly, but now she understood why the royal guards took their job so seriously. They weren't just standing there for fun. They were protecting history, tradition, and security. Feeling hungry, she decided to stop at a small cafe nearby. As she sat down with a cup of tea, she noticed a group of people talking at the next table. "Did you see that video of the woman who touched the Royal Guard's rifle?" One of them asked. Karen's stomach tightened. They were talking about her. "Yeah," another person said, but she apologized, so at least she realized her mistake. Karen felt a strange mix of emotions: embarrassment, relief, and a little bit of hope. People weren't just making fun of her. Some understood that she had learned a lesson. Just then, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her best friend back home. "Karen, I saw the video. What happened? Are you okay?" Karen hesitated before replying. "Yeah, I messed up. I didn't realize how serious it was at the time. But I learned my lesson." Her friend responded almost immediately. "Well, at least you didn't get arrested. But wow, Karen, you really went viral." Karen laughed softly. It was true. She had gone viral, but not for the reasons she would have wanted. Still, she was determined not to let this define her. She took a deep breath and looked around the cafe. Life was moving on, and so would she. This experience had taught her something important, not just about the Royal Guards, but about respecting the rules and thinking before acting. As she finished her tea, she made a promise to herself. From now on, she would be more mindful of her actions. This mistake would not be repeated. With that thought, she stood up, ready to continue exploring London. This time, with a new perspective. Karen took a deep breath as she stepped out of the cafe. The cool London air felt refreshing against her skin. She had spent the last hour reflecting on everything that had happened, and now she was ready to move forward. The city around her was as lively as ever, with tourists snapping pictures and locals rushing about their day. But Karen felt different. The day had started with excitement, turned into embarrassment, and now, finally, it was ending with a valuable lesson. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from her older brother. "Saw the video. What were you thinking?" Karen sighed. She knew her family would see it eventually. There was no escaping it now. But instead of feeling upset, she decided to respond honestly. "I wasn't thinking. That was the problem. But I get it now. I learned my lesson." A few minutes later, her brother replied. "Good. Just don't do anything like that again. We were worried about you." Karen smiled. Even though the situation had been stressful, it was comforting to know that her family cared. As she continued walking, she found herself near another historic landmark. This time, she kept her distance, watching how other tourists behaved. Some were laughing and posing for photos, while others stood in quiet admiration. Karen felt a new sense of appreciation for places like this. A couple nearby was taking pictures, and the man playfully tried to get close to a security guard. His wife quickly pulled him back. "Don't," she whispered. "Remember that video we saw earlier? You don't want to end up like her." Karen felt a mix of emotions, embarrassment, but also relief. Maybe her mistake had actually taught others to be more careful. She turned a corner and saw a souvenir shop. On a whim, she stepped inside. The shelves were filled with postcards, keychains, and little figurines of the Royal Guards. She picked up a small detailed model of a guard in his red uniform and tall black hat. The shopkeeper smiled. "Ah, the Queen's Guard. Very disciplined men." Karen nodded. "I know that now," she said with a small smile. She bought the figurine and tucked it into her bag. It would serve as a reminder, not just of her trip to London, but of the important lesson she had learned. As the sun began to set, Karen made her way back to her hotel. Tomorrow, she would continue exploring the city, but this time, she would be more mindful, more respectful. This trip had turned out differently than she had expected, but in the end, she was grateful. She had learned something important, not just about the Royal Guards, but about responsibility, awareness, and respect. And no matter how many people watched that viral video, She knew that the most important thing was what she had taken away from the experience. With a deep breath, she smiled to herself and walked into the evening, ready for whatever came next.